Good evening. Happy Easter Sunday to you all. And a slight change to our planned programming. We're not having our courtroom drama, putting the resurrection on trial this evening for obvious reasons. But instead I've been asked to give a talk that reflects on the current situation facing us in the world. Tonight's message is entitled, Is There Any Hope? Coronavirus. Now it's said that the only certain things in life are death and taxes. And while we often complain about tax, we rarely talk about death. Whereas in the past, talking about sex was taboo and everyone talked about death, today it's the reverse. Talking about death is taboo today, while everyone feels quite comfortable talking about sex. Now, of course, things have changed a little bit in the last 4 weeks, haven't they? With the coronavirus pandemic spreading across the world, locking down our country. Now every day we hear a death count on the news. We read terrifying, scary, anxiety-producing headlines about the number of people who are becoming sick. The nation is gripped in the vice of anxiety. Let me suggest that the reason why ordinarily we prefer to avoid the topic of death is not out of politeness, but it's out of fear. Death is the great unknown. It's what Shakespeare called in Hamlet, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. Our mortality forces us to confront some of the most significant questions, like, is this life, in this world, all there is? Or is there something more? Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? Is there a judgment and a reward based upon how we have lived our lives in this world? Here in the secular Western world, the answer seems to be no. This is it. This life in this world, that's all there is. For example, prior to his death last year, Stephen Hawking famously said, I regard the brain as a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There is no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. That is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. However, not everyone is comfortable nor convinced by what Dr. Hawking had to say. To illustrate that, let me tell you two stories, one from the West and one from the East. Firstly, let me introduce you to Professor Jürgen Habermas, one of Europe's leading intellectuals. A few years ago, Habermas attended the memorial service of a friend. His friend was a committed atheist, and yet interestingly, he requested that his funeral be held in St. Peter's Church in Zurich. Although there was no religious content in the service, it took place surrounded by the stained glass windows and sacred symbols of the Christian faith. And later in his book, An Awareness of Something Missing, Habermas reflected on the strangeness of his friend's funeral request. He wrote, This is a sign that the enlightened modern age has failed to find a suitable replacement for a religious way of coping with the final rite of passage which brings life to a close. Habermas joins with a host of other people who suggest that there is a sense of something missing in our secular account of the world, especially at significant moments like birth and death. Death becomes hopeless, meaningless, nothingness. And yet we wish it wasn't so. Secondly, let me tell you another story, this time from the East. Let me introduce you to the Japanese poet Kobayashi Issa. Issa endured a series of tragedies with his wife. His first son died aged just 1 month old. Afterwards, his second son died also just 1 month old. And then his daughter, the joy of his heart, the delight of his eyes, she died, aged just 2. In the agonies of grief and sadness, he sought counsel from the local Buddhist temple. But the only comfort he received from the Buddhist scriptures was a mantra. He was told to go away and meditate on the fact that the world is dew. Nothing lasts. Things are here one moment and then gone, just like the little dew droplets on the grass in the morning which are evaporated when the sun rises. However, shortly after these events, Issa wrote this haiku poem, which expresses in words his feelings. This world of dew is a world of dew. And yet. Those haunting words reveal deep in his soul, Kobayashi Issa longed and hoped for something more than this fleeting and dying world. And he's not alone. All of us who have lost loved ones know exactly what he means, exactly how he feels. Now, isn't it interesting that although all of us have been born into this world of death and decay, all of us sense it ought not to be this way. We resent our mortality, we rebel against it, and we possess the capacity for hope. It's like we're square pegs in round holes. We don't seem to fit and belong into this dying world. We long for something more. But here's a thought. What if our longings and dreams of a life lived happily ever after, what if our yearnings to never be parted from those that we love, what if they weren't illusions? What if our desires are telling us something true about the nature of the world in which we live and the nature of reality? I love how the skeptic turned Christian C.S. Lewis put it many years ago. He said, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." And that is precisely the kind of hope that you will find in the Christian message of Easter. At the heart of Christianity is the person of Jesus Christ, the God who has died and risen again and promised eternal life to all who will trust him and follow him. The claim that Jesus has risen from the dead was as controversial in the first century as it is today in the 21st century. After all, the fact that dead people stay dead is not a new discovery, not one made by modern philosophers and scientists. And that's a point that's made by Professor N.T. Wright of St. Andrews University in his huge academic study on the resurrection. He writes, "Christianity was born into a world where its central claim was known to be false. The fact that dead people do not ordinarily rise is itself part of early Christian belief, not an objection to it. The early Christians insisted that what had happened to Jesus was precisely something new, was indeed the start of a whole new creation." What makes Christianity different from all of the other philosophies and world religions is the fact that it is based on something that has really happened in human history. It offers us a hope that we can investigate for ourselves. And if you've never had the opportunity to look at the evidence for yourself, then in the next few minutes, I want to take you to one of the historical accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. It's based upon eyewitness testimony which has been investigated by those who lived at the time. It's contained in the Gospel of Luke. Luke tells us at the start of his work that he set out to research and investigate the evidence for himself. He interviewed the eyewitnesses. He gathered together all the pieces of evidence that he could find. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." And look at the end of his account of what happened to Jesus. He presents to us 3 Easter facts. Let me take you through each of them. The first is an inconvenient fact. Luke tells us on the first day of the week, this is Easter Sunday morning, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. And he names them Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and then some others. And what's interesting is the very first thing that Luke tells us about are the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. And they were women. That was an inconvenient fact. Why, you ask? Well, in the first century, we're dealing with a man's world, in which a woman's voice and testimony was not even admissible evidence in court. And this matters because if Luke was in any way embellishing or fabricating this story, then the very simplest change that he could have made would be to airbrush the gender of the first witnesses, to make them men, not women. But Luke didn't do that. He makes this embarrassing admission, which instantly gave people around about him a reason to doubt the credibility of his account. And why? Why does he shoot himself in the foot? Well, it's because he's recording with integrity what really happened, even though it's not necessarily helpful. But that increases and enhances his credibility as a historian in our eyes. And so there we are. The first Easter fact is an inconvenient fact about the first eyewitnesses being women. The second thing then is an undeniable fact. Luke tells us a very basic fact that all historians agree upon, which is that the tomb of Jesus was empty. He goes on and says they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And then it goes on and says, but the men, these men who appear in white linen clothes, shining, angels, the men said to them, why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. The tomb of Jesus Christ was empty on Easter Sunday morning. Everyone agrees upon that fact. The question is, why was it empty? And any explanation for how it got to be empty has to account for all of the different pieces of historical evidence that we have access to. And so for a few moments, I want to suggest that we become Sherlock Holmes the detective, that we consider the evidence and consider the possibilities. First of all, working away from bottom to top of this diagram on the screen, maybe Jesus didn't really die. But let's think about that. It's unlikely, because the Roman soldiers at Calvary were expert executioners, and under Roman law their lives depended upon not allowing a prisoner to escape. And so they had every reason to ensure that Jesus was dead before they would release his body for burial. That's why we read in some of the accounts that they thrust a spear into Jesus' side, his chest, to pierce through his heart, to ensure that he truly was dead before they took him down off the cross. All the signs point to the fact that Jesus really died. Contemporary historians like Tacitus and Lucian, the Romans, record the fact that Jesus was executed under the reign of Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem at this time. So, maybe Jesus didn't really die. That doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Another possibility is, working our way up, maybe Jesus died, but the disciples conspired to hide the body. In fact, this is a conspiracy theory that did its rounds. In the first century, Matthew in his gospel records how this came about. The guards who were guarding the tomb were bribed to say this is what happened. But there's a huge problem here, and it's the problem of motivation on the part of the disciples. Luke and indeed all of the gospel writers are very honest and candid with us that when Jesus was arrested, put on trial, and condemned to be executed, he was abandoned by his disciples. They ran away in fear of their lives. They wanted to save their own necks. And yet shortly after that, in just a matter of days, a dramatic change seems to have come upon them. These fearful cowards have been turned into fearless preachers of Jesus and the resurrection from the dead. Rather than fade into the background and going on to live quiet, comfortable lives, these very first Christians suffered rejection and persecution, and all of them martyrdom for their confession that they were eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, people die in the world for their beliefs all the time, but rarely do people choose to die for their own fabricated lies when they're given a chance to tell the truth and save their necks. No, there is no good explanation for the motivation of the disciples in making up this lie and maintain that lie through all of their suffering, all of their pain, even to ignominious deaths. No, these were convinced men, not men in conspiracy with one another. A third possibility is maybe Jesus died, but the disciples had a hallucination. Maybe they thought in their grief and their pain and sadness that they saw Jesus alive again, but they were mistaken. Well, there's a few problems here. The first one is that this explanation fails to explain why the tomb of Jesus was empty. You see, if the disciples were simply having grief-stricken hallucinations, it wouldn't take long for the disciples to produce the dead body from the tomb and show everybody that the disciples were mistaken. That didn't happen. Also, if the disciples were hallucinating, then they would have seen something different than what is recorded. As Jews, they would have seen Jesus in heaven. They would not have seen Jesus risen in a body on the earth. You see, they had no category for what they claimed had happened to Jesus. The Greeks and the Romans, the predominant powers and philosophers of the age, they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, certainly not the bodily resurrection of the dead. Plato and others believed that the best possible salvation was the escape of the soul from the body. The idea of having a body again in the afterlife, that was just detestable to them. Jews did believe in a resurrection of the body, but only one that was universal, of all people on the last day. They had no category for the resurrection of one man in a body in the middle of history. That's why whenever Jesus 3 or 4 times before his crucifixion told his disciples he would die and rise again, why they record for us, they didn't understand what he was talking about. They just didn't have a category for this. And so if they were having a hallucination, they would not have hallucinated this idea. It would have not fitted and made any sense in their heads at all. They proclaim something that doesn't make sense, that people haven't anticipated up until this point. And that then leaves us with a fourth possibility. And that's that Jesus died and he did rise again. And Sherlock Holmes would say that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And that then takes us on to the third and final thing, which is a tangible fact. You see, it wasn't just merely the absence of a dead body in a tomb that convinced the first Christians that Jesus had risen again from the dead. Instead, it was the actual living presence of the resurrected one. On its own, an empty tomb with a missing body could be dismissed as a mystery or a tragedy. On their own, signs of a dead loved one could be dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations. However, together, an empty tomb and physical appearances, they are powerful pieces of evidence that cause us and compel us to consider the historical reality that Jesus rose again from the dead. And Luke records how Jesus appeared physically and tangibly, first of all to the women, later to 2 of the disciples, later to 11 of them. Other accounts, early accounts in the New Testament tell us that Jesus appeared to individuals and groups and crowds over the following weeks. People not just saw Jesus, but they talked with him, they touched him. And these appearances were not just to people who already were inclined to believe in him, but they also transformed the lives of people who were previously skeptics, like James, the half-brother of Jesus, and even enemies of Jesus in the church, like Saul of Tarsus, who becomes Paul, the greatest missionary in Christian history. Jesus is living, walking, talking proof that death has been beaten, and that one day God is going to make all of the sad things in this world come untrue. And that is the answer to our question tonight. Coronavirus, is there any hope? Yes. The resurrection of Jesus from the dead says that there is hope. We've thought about the evidence this evening. Someone else who's looked at the evidence is Charles Foster. He's a barrister and part-time judge of the Crown Court in London. And with his legal mind and with forensic scrutiny, he has examined the evidence for and against the resurrection in his wonderful little book, The Jesus Inquest. He concludes, the merely historical evidence for the resurrection is very good. The historical resurrection is easily the most probable explanation for all the data that we have. You do have to believe some remarkable things if you don't believe the resurrection. And I don't have the faith to believe those things. That's quite a statement from a lawyer. We want to encourage you this Easter to think about examining the evidence for yourself, especially right now in the situation that faces us in the world. You see, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead transforms our experience of the coronavirus pandemic. It tells each one of us that even should the very worst happen, that there is hope, that death is not the end. You see, Jesus has conquered death. He has made a way possible to empty your grave, whenever and however it is filled. All who die trusted in Jesus can close their eyes in this world and be assured of opening them again in heaven. Easter tells us that this hope is not just wishful thinking. It's not just pie in the sky when you die, but it's a credible hope. It's based on the things that really happened in human history to Jesus for us. So this Easter, why not find out more? Why not pick up a gospel? Why not read it through? Learn about Jesus, who he is, why he came, what he has done for you to reveal God's love and to change your eternal destiny. Why not pick up a book like The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, which looks at the historical evidence for Jesus and the things which are recorded about Jesus in the historical documents? And why not see if Jesus can bring you hope in a time whenever this world has never needed it anymore? Thanks so much for listening and joining us this Easter Sunday night. And may God bless you. Good night.